Ignorant black trash, nothing. That's what President Donald Trump snarled inside the chambers of Congress, words meant to erase Jasmine Crockett, to reduce her to dust before a nation of 330 million. But here's the number he never saw coming. Over 82 million Americans tuned in live, their eyes locked on a so-called rookie who refused to bow. For decades, power silenced voices like hers. For centuries, racism tried to chain justice to the floor. Yet in this single hearing, one woman dared to break those chains. Jasmine Crockett did not just answer an insult. She turned that insult into a weapon, and in less than 9 minutes, she would transform a president's arrogance into the greatest public humiliation of his career. The chamber was suffocatingly full. Every seat in Congress had been claimed, every aisle buzzing with restless whispers, and every camera light glaring like unblinking eyes. Beyond these walls, millions of Americans were glued to their televisions, their radios, their phones, waiting for the clash they knew was inevitable. Donald Trump sat like a monarch, chin raised, his lips curled into that infamous smirk, a smirk that promised destruction for anyone who dared to stand against him. His tailored suit glistened under the fluorescent lights, a black throne in motion. He did not look nervous. No, he looked entertained, as though Jasmine Crockett was nothing more than a warm-up act in his never-ending circus of power. She was seated across from him, her frame straight as steel, her eyes locked forward with the fire of a woman who knew history's weight was pressing against her shoulders. She did not smile. She did not blink. She radiated the stillness of a soldier who had already accepted the possibility of war. The chairman raised the gavel. The crowd hushed. The sound of one sharp bang echoed through the chamber, ricocheting off marble columns like the crack of a rifle. "Order," the chairman said. His voice carried the gravitas of a man who knew what was at stake. "This hearing will come to session." And then Jasmine rose. The room seemed to lean with her, every camera pivoting, every set of eyes following. She planted her palms on the table before her, spine unbent, and her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Today, the truth will no longer be buried." It was not a shout, it was a vow. The words did not simply echo within the chamber. They reverberated across living rooms in Ohio, in Georgia, in Detroit, in the very places where people had been told their voices did not matter. Grandmothers clutched their remote controls tighter. Veterans leaned closer to their radios. Factory workers on their lunch break froze, mid-bite, just to hear her next breath. And yet inside the chamber, the effect was electric. Some gasped, some nodded, eyes wide, and some scoffed, Trump among them. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, his smirk spreading wider. Then in that booming, dismissive tone America had come to know all too well, he muttered just loud enough for the microphones to capture, "She's nothing but a joke." The phrase rippled through the room like gasoline on open flame. A few allies chuckled nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jasmine, however, did not flinch. Her eyes darted to him, sharp, unyielding, and for a split second the smirk faltered. The chairman cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Crockett, you may proceed." And the storm began. She straightened her notes, but she didn't need them. Her voice rang steady, controlled, like a symphony building from its first note. "For too long," she began, "power has been wielded as if it were permission to silence, to threaten, to erase. But power is not a weapon. It is a responsibility. And when that responsibility is broken, when it is abused, this chamber becomes the battlefield of truth." The words sank into the air, heavy and undeniable. A few members of the audience erupted into murmurs. Journalists scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like firecrackers. Trump scoffed, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "Save your little speeches, sweetheart," he sneered. "You're out of your league." The insult was meant to derail her. Instead, it fueled her. She leaned forward, her gaze piercing through the lights, the lenses, the very soul of the room. "Out of my league?" Her voice sharpened. "Tell me then, Mr. President, what league is it where billions of taxpayer dollars vanish into shadow accounts overseas? What league is it where justice is sold to the highest bidder, while the people who trusted you are left with nothing but empty promises?" The chamber erupted in gasps. The words landed like thunderclaps, each syllable striking harder than the last. Trump stiffened, his jaw twitching ever so slightly. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Jasmine pressed on. I stand here today not to trade insults with you. I stand here because the American people demand answers. And for every insult you hurl, for every attempt to silence me, I will return with a question that demands the truth. Her voice rose, no longer steady but soaring, alive with righteous fury. You wanted a circus? You wanted a show? Fine. But the only act the American people deserve today is the unveiling of your lies. The audience exploded, some in applause, others in outrage. The chairman's gavel pounded for order, but even his strikes could not contain the tempest Jasmine had unleashed. Trump shifted in his seat. The smirk had vanished now, replaced by a glower. His knuckles whitened against the polished oak of the table before him. For the first time that day, the mask of untouchable power cracked, and Jasmine knew it. She inhaled deeply, steadying her breath. The fire in her eyes did not waver. She had not come for survival. She had come for victory. Mr. President, she said softly, almost gently, but her words carried like gunfire. Today is not the day I fall silent. Today is the day your silence finally begins. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Every camera zoomed tighter. The nation held its breath. And in that charged, fragile moment, before the storm could truly break, Jasmine Crockett stood not as a congresswoman, not as a target of insults, but as a warrior who had just declared war inside the very heart of American power. Trump leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. His fingers spread wide as though he were about to crush the wood beneath them. His eyes narrowed, lips curling back into that familiar snarl America had seen 1,000 times before. The room braced itself. Then, like a thunderclap, his voice exploded. Lies, he roared, the word cracking through the chamber like a whip. Every word out of her mouth is a lie. She is nothing more than a puppet, another tool of the radical left. Gasps scattered across the room. Cameras zoomed closer, the sound of shutters snapping like gunfire. Trump wasn't finished. His voice rose higher, booming with the cadence of a man who had built his empire on showmanship. He slammed his palm against the oak table, the sound reverberating across the chamber. This hearing, this circus, is nothing but a cheap political stunt. That's all this is. The chamber erupted into noise. Some lawmakers shouted in agreement, pounding their fists on their desks. Others recoiled, shaking their heads, appalled by the president's spectacle. The chairman's gavel struck once, twice, 3 times. Order! The chamber will come to order! But order was gone. The storm had begun. Trump's face flushed crimson as he pointed across the room, his finger jabbing toward Jasmine like a dagger. Crockett doesn't care about the truth. She doesn't care about the American people. She's chasing fame, chasing headlines, chasing the cameras that keep flashing in her face. His words were poison, calculated to humiliate, to strip her down before the nation. She's a fraud, he barked. A fraud who dares to stand here and pretend she's a hero. The insult ricocheted off the chamber walls, bouncing into living rooms across the country. Some at home cheered, their fists in the air. Others felt a sickening churn in their stomachs, watching the most powerful man in the nation spit venom with such cruelty. Through it all, Jasmine did not move. She sat still as stone, her hands folded, her eyes steady and unblinking. The fire in her gaze did not falter, not once, and that unshakable calm only seemed to enrage him further. Trump's fist struck the table again. She talks about justice, he sneered, but justice has never been on her side. She represents corruption. She represents weakness. And she dares to stand against me? He leaned back in his chair, throwing his arms wide, addressing not just the chamber, but the nation itself. I built this country's greatness. I carried it on my shoulders. And now I'm being forced to answer to a nobody, a loud, ignorant nobody who thinks she's going to bring me down. The chamber filled with shouts, cheers, jeers, cries of protest. Reporters scribbled frantically, their hands flying across notebooks. Trump's allies smirked, emboldened by his fury. His enemies shook their heads, whispering under their breath. And still Jasmine remained motionless. Her silence was not weakness, it was defiance. It was power. The chairman raised his gavel again, but Trump's voice bulldozed over him. "This hearing will be remembered," Trump declared, his voice vibrating through the air like the rumble of a storm. "Not as a pursuit of truth, but as the moment America saw how far the radical left would go to destroy a president who has done more for this country than anyone before him." He jabbed the air with his finger, eyes blazing. "And this woman, this Crockett, she's nothing but their latest puppet, a face for their lies, a mask for their corruption, a joke." The word cracked like a whip, sharp and final. But as the echoes died, the room shifted. Slowly, eyes turned, not toward Trump, but toward Jasmine. Because she had not broken. She had not blinked. Her calm was deafening, her silence louder than his screams. And in that silence, a different kind of tension began to grow. The cameras found her face, and in that moment, millions of Americans saw not a woman crushed by power, but a warrior quietly preparing her strike. The contrast was stunning. Trump raged, red-faced, spittle catching the light. Jasmine sat serene, her gaze unwavering, her presence unshaken. And for the first time, the question began to whisper across the chamber, into the streets, into the homes of America. What happens when arrogance collides with unbreakable resolve? Trump pounded the table once more, his voice cracking under its own fury. "This ends here," he thundered. "I will not be lectured by you, by anyone, especially not by her." His voice rattled the microphones, the very air trembling under the weight of his anger. And yet, the more he shouted, the more fragile his power seemed, the more desperate his voice became. The gavel slammed again and again, trying to bring control. "Order! The chamber will come to order!" Finally, silence began to creep back, slow and uneasy, like the air after lightning strikes. Trump glared across the room, his chest heaving, his hands trembling on the desk before him. He believed he had struck first. He believed he had landed the fatal blow. But Jasmine's stillness told a different story. She had not spoken a word, and already she had turned his fury into his weakness. And when she finally did open her mouth, the entire chamber would feel it. Because the real storm, the storm that would change everything, had yet to begin. Jasmine Crockett reached slowly for the folder before her. Her fingers brushed over its edge, calm and deliberate, as though she were unsheathing a blade. The cameras zoomed closer. Every microphone leaned in. The nation itself seemed to hold its breath. She opened the folder. Pages of crisp, damning records stared back at her, each line dripping with numbers too vast to ignore, too deliberate to dismiss. Her eyes flicked once toward Trump. His smirk had returned, faint and mocking. But beneath it, if you look closely enough, there was the twitch of a jaw, the unease of a man who knew what might be coming. Jasmine lifted the first sheet, raising it high enough for the cameras to catch the bold lettering, the highlighted transfers, the undeniable figures. Her voice was steady, cold, precise. "Mr. President," she began, her words slicing into the chamber like a scalpel. "How do you explain billions of dollars wired to a shell company overseas, during your administration, under your authority, signed off by your closest advisors?" The chamber gasped as one. The sound spread like a ripple through water. Shock, disbelief, anticipation. Cameras flashed, pens scratched furiously across notepads. Trump's head jerked upward. For a fleeting second, his mask cracked. His eyes widened, just a fraction, just enough for those watching closely to see. But then the smirk snapped back into place. He leaned back, shrugged, and let out a dismissive chuckle. "Fake news," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "That's all this is. More fake news." The words hung in the air, but they fell flat. Because unlike sound bites on a campaign stage, unlike tweets fired off into the void, this was different. This was live, under oath, with millions watching. And this time, there were papers in Jasmine's hands, papers he could not simply erase. Jasmine did not flinch. She did not even blink. She slid another page forward across the table, her nails tapping against the highlighted section for emphasis. "This isn't a headline, Mr. President," she said evenly. "This isn't a rumor. These are your government's own transaction records, obtained through subpoenas. Are you calling your own Treasury Department fake? Gasps again, louder now. Even members of Trump's party shifted in their seats, whispering urgently among themselves. Trump's jaw tightened. His hand balled into a fist against the table. You don't understand business, he snapped. You never have. These are normal, completely normal transfers. Anyone who's ever run something bigger than a lemonade stand would know that. He laughed, but it was hollow, brittle, and it didn't echo the way he wanted it to. Jasmine leaned closer. Her eyes bore into his with the force of a hammer meeting stone. Billions of dollars, she repeated slowly, transferred offshore, funneled through companies with no employees, no offices, no legitimate services. Are you asking the American people to believe this was normal? The silence that followed was suffocating. Trump opened his mouth, then shut it. He shifted in his seat, pulling at his tie, as if the air had grown too tight around his throat. Finally, he scoffed. You people will twist anything. It's pathetic. But his voice cracked on the word pathetic, and the cameras caught it. The journalists knew it. The crowd felt it. Across the country, living rooms erupted in whispers and gasps, in the slow dawning realization that something historic was unfolding live before their eyes. Jasmine pressed on, relentless. Billions, she said again, her voice rising. Money that could have gone to schools, to hospitals, to veterans sleeping under bridges tonight. Instead, it vanished into the shadows. And you sit here laughing? Her words seared through the air. They were no longer just questions. They were accusations, heavy and undeniable. Trump's smirk faltered. His face flushed crimson, his hands slamming once more against the table. Lies, he thundered. All of it. You think you can stand there and lecture me? You think the American people are stupid enough to believe this garbage? But his roar did not silence her. It only amplified her. She leaned in closer, her voice cutting sharper, steadier, almost whispering now, but so controlled that the microphones caught every syllable. No, Mr. President, the American people are not stupid. They are watching, they are listening, and they are waiting for you to answer the question you cannot escape. Where did the money go? The chamber erupted. Reporters shouted over one another, camera shutters firing like machine guns. Lawmakers leapt to their feet, shouting, pointing, demanding order. The chairman's gavel slammed again and again, but the chamber had become a battlefield. And at its center, Trump and Jasmine locked eyes, two forces colliding, one with fury, the other with resolve. For the first time that day, Trump had no ready line, no rehearsed insult, no effortless deflection. He sat there, his mouth working soundlessly, his hand trembling ever so slightly against the table. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply turned another page, sliding it forward, ready to deliver her next strike. Because this was no longer just a hearing, this was a reckoning, and it had only just begun. The moment Jasmine's words cut through the air, the chamber detonated. Lawyers on both sides leapt to their feet, shouting over one another, their voices clashing like dueling swords. One accused, the other objected, their tones venomous, their faces flushed with rage. Nervous aides scrambled, clutching documents, whispering frantically to their bosses. Reporters shouted questions, their voices colliding in a frantic storm. Members of Congress rose from their seats, some pounding fists against desks, others pointing accusing fingers across the aisle. Objection! One of Trump's attorneys bellowed, his voice echoing through the marble chamber. You don't get to object to the truth, shouted one of Jasmine's allies, his face crimson with fury. The sound was chaos incarnate, like 100 drums beating out of rhythm, and all the while Trump's glare locked onto Jasmine. His lips moved, muttering curses under his breath, as though every insult in his arsenal was begging to be unleashed. The cameras caught everything. They swung from Trump's clenched fists to Jasmine's unflinching stare. From the red-faced lawyers to the chairman, who slammed his gavel again and again, his voice hoarse from shouting, "Order! The chamber will come to order." But order was gone. This was a storm now, and it was being broadcast live into every home in America. In living rooms across the country, jaws dropped. Elderly veterans sat forward in their chairs. Mothers hushed their children, straining to hear each rising note of the fury. In diners, in bars, in small-town kitchens, Americans leaned toward flickering television screens, watching as their democracy seemed to shake on its very foundation. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was war. One lawmaker slammed his notebook onto the table so hard the sound cracked like a gunshot. Another shouted so loudly his voice broke, his words tumbling into incoherence. Trump's lead counsel waved his arms furiously, his fingers stabbing the air. This is slander. These are baseless accusations meant to smear the President of the United States. But Jasmine's attorney rose just as fast, his voice a whip across the chaos. Baseless? Then explain the documents, explain the signatures, explain why the President's name appears on every authorization line. The words rippled through the chamber, igniting fresh uproar. And through it all, through the shouting, the pounding, the gavel slamming in futility, Jasmine remained still. Her calmness was infuriating. It was magnetic. The storm raged around her, yet she sat poised, her hands folded over the file of evidence, her gaze fixed on Trump. It was as if she were silently daring him to rise above the noise, to face her, to answer, and he couldn't. So instead, he let his fury infect the room, let his allies bark on his behalf, let the spectacle grow until it was no longer a hearing, but a battlefield. The chairman stood, his gavel raised like a weapon, his face pale with strain. "This chamber," he thundered, "will return to order." The gavel struck again, its echo like a gunshot. But even his authority wavered beneath the weight of the pandemonium. Because outside, beyond the thick stone walls, the people were watching. The storm inside was spilling outward. News anchors broke into live commentary, voices trembling with disbelief. Hashtags erupted online, surging into millions of posts. Protesters and supporters alike began to gather at the steps of the Capitol, their chants faint but rising, a ghostly echo filtering into the chamber. The people could feel it. The country could feel it. Something was breaking. Trump finally stood. The motion alone silenced a fraction of the noise. All eyes swung toward him, as though gravity itself shifted when he moved. He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward, his face twisted with fury. His voice boomed once more, drowning out every other sound. "This is a disgrace," he thundered. "A sham. This hearing is not about truth. It's about power. It's about taking down the greatest president this country has ever had." His allies erupted into cheers, pounding their desks in rhythm, their voices rising to drown out the opposition. "Witch hunt," one cried. "Witch hunt," others echoed. The chant grew louder, a feverish beat of defiance. But across the aisle, lawmakers jeered, shouting accusations, waving documents, demanding answers. The clash was deafening. Two armies screaming across the battlefield of Congress. Through it all, Jasmine rose slowly to her feet. The movement alone silenced cameras, silenced journalists, silenced enough of the chamber for her voice to cut through like steel. "Mr. President," she said, her tone low, calm, but laced with fire. The shouting faltered, voices stumbling into silence, desperate to hear the next words. Jasmine lifted the folder again, the pages trembling slightly. Not from her, but from the weight of the storm raging around her. She took a breath, and then she said, "You can call it a witch hunt. You can call it a sham. You can call it whatever name you like. But there is one thing you cannot call it: false." The chamber froze. The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing the flicker of rage that crossed Trump's face. The chairman's gavel hovered midair, suspended, forgotten. Because in that instant, Jasmine Crockett had not only pierced through the noise, she had claimed the silence. And in that silence, the storm didn't end. It shifted. From chaos to anticipation, from fury to fear, from noise to the terrifying calm before the next thunderclap. The battle was far from over. But in that moment, everyone inside the chamber knew. Jasmine had just seized control of the storm. Then came the words that made the entire room still. "The committee will now call its next witness." At first, the chamber buzzed with confusion. Witness? No one had expected another testimony today. The agenda had not listed one. Trump's lawyers turned sharply to one another, their whispers frantic, their faces taut with sudden unease. The double doors at the back of the chamber creaked open. Footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, each one drawing the collective breath tighter in the throats of everyone present. And then he appeared. A man in a dark suit, his hair silver, his face carved by years of power and secrets. He carried no notes, no folders, only himself. And that was enough. Because the moment he crossed the threshold, the chamber erupted in gasps. It was Robert Halstead, former senior advisor to the White House, a man who had once been Trump's right hand, the keeper of his inner circle's darkest strategies. Trump's face drained of color. His smirk collapsed into something raw, something sharp. Panic masked as fury. His hand gripped the table so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, this is a setup. He has no authority to be here." The chairman ignored him. The gavel struck once. "The witness will take his seat." Robert Halstead walked with measured calm, like a man who knew every step was being etched into history. He sat, adjusted the microphone, and folded his hands. The silence was unbearable. Jasmine's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Not gloating, not mocking, simply certain. The queen had just moved her piece across the board. Her ace had arrived. Trump slammed his palm against the table. "This is illegal," he barked. "He's a traitor. He doesn't belong here. I demand this farce be thrown out." His voice cracked on the last word. Cameras caught it. The world caught it. But the chairman's voice cut across his fury. "The witness has been sworn in. He will speak." The chamber leaned forward as one. Halstead raised his eyes, meeting Jasmine's gaze first. She gave a small nod, one warrior acknowledging another. Then he turned to Trump. The air tightened. The storm deepened. Trump sneered, his voice low and venomous. "You owe me, Halstead. Remember who made you. You betray me now, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life." But Halstead did not flinch. His eyes were cold, steady, almost mournful. "Mr. President," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "what I regret is how long I stayed silent." The words detonated, gasps, shouts, frantic scribbles of pens. The camera zeroed in on Trump, whose face twisted into a grotesque mask of disbelief. Jasmine leaned back slightly, letting the moment breathe, letting the weight of those words sink deep into every ear listening. Trump lashed out, his hand waving wildly. "He's lying. He's been threatened, coerced, bribed." But Halstead cut him off, his voice rising above the chaos. "No, sir. I came here willingly, because I saw what you did, because I know where the money went." The chamber fell silent, deadly electric silence. Jasmine seized the silence with surgical precision. "Mr. Halstead," she said gently, her voice sharp enough to pierce steel, "can you tell this committee and the American people exactly what you witnessed?" Halstead inhaled slowly. His eyes swept the room before fixing back on Jasmine. "I can," he said, "and I will." He reached into his jacket pocket. For a heartbeat, tension snapped like a wire. Trump's lawyers half rose. Secret Service tensed. But all Halstead produced was a small flash drive. He placed it on the table with a soft click. The sound echoed louder than any gavel. "This," he said, "contains communications, emails, call logs, directives that tie the president directly to the offshore accounts in question. He authorized them, he approved them, and he profited from them." The chamber exploded. Lawyers screamed objections. Lawmakers shouted accusations. Reporters shouted questions. The gavel thundered uselessly. But the cameras caught the only thing that mattered. Donald Trump's face. No longer smug. No longer in control. It was the face of a man cornered. His mouth opened, but the words tumbled out jagged, desperate. "Fake. All of it fake. You'll never prove it. It won't stand in court." But his voice shook, and America heard it. Jasmine leaned forward now, her voice calm, unyielding. "Mr. President," she said, "the truth doesn't need to wait for court. It's standing right here, in front of you, in front of the nation, and no amount of shouting will bury it." Her words rang like a verdict. Halstead sat silently beside her, the flash drive glinting under the harsh white lights. And Trump, for the first time in the hearing, had no smirk, no sneer, no script. Only silence. The chamber crackled with anticipation. The storm was no longer at its peak. No, it was still building, higher, heavier, more dangerous. Because this was not just evidence. This was betrayal. The defection of a man from Trump's own inner circle, turning his secrets into chains that now bound him to the table. And as the cameras captured every second, the nation understood. Jasmine Crockett had not only brought evidence, she had brought a weapon, one that could shatter a presidency. Trump's chair screeched against the marble floor as he shot to his feet, his face a storm of crimson rage. His voice thundered across the chamber, shaking the microphones, reverberating into living rooms across America. "Traitor!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Robert Halstead. "You're nothing but a traitor, a liar, a snake who sold his soul because they threatened you, because they bought you." The chamber shook with noise, gasps, murmurs, shouts. Trump's allies pounded their desks, echoing his fury, while his opponents demanded silence. But Trump wasn't done. His voice cracked like fire. "You sat in my meetings, you ate at my table, you rode on my plane, and now you dare stand here and accuse me? You're a fraud, Halstead, a disgrace." His words spat across the chamber, venom dripping from every syllable. "Everything you say is a lie," he bellowed. "Every word, fabricated. They've turned you into their puppet, their weapon. You're pathetic. Pathetic." Halstead did not move. His face remained steady, his hands clasped before him, his silence more powerful than Trump's hurricane. But Jasmine rose. Her voice cut across the chaos like tempered steel, controlled, sharp, impossible to ignore. "Mr. President," she said, her tone slicing through the uproar, "you may insult the witness. You may slander his name, his loyalty, his character, but you cannot insult the evidence he carries." The chamber fell into a hushed ripple. Cameras swung to her, capturing the flash in her eyes, the unbending fire in her stance. "You cannot," she repeated, her voice ringing, "deny what is real, not with anger, not with insults, not even with the weight of your office." Trump spun toward her, his face twisted with rage. "You think you're clever?" he snapped. "You think your rehearsed speeches and fake evidence mean anything? This is my country. These people don't care about your little show. They care about strength, and I'm the strongest leader they've ever had." The words burst from him like cannon fire, loud, desperate, drowning in bravado. But Jasmine stepped forward, her tone colder now, every word sharpened into a blade. "Strength?" she asked. "Is strength stealing from the very people you swore to serve? Is strength siphoning billions into shadows while veterans sleep on concrete and children go hungry?" Her voice rose, fierce, alive with indignation. "Is that your definition of leadership? To hoard power, to cling to wealth while the nation bleeds?" The room exploded. Cheers, outrage, fists pounding on desks. The chairman's gavel thundered again and again, lost in the noise. Trump's face glistened with sweat, his jaw set tight, but he forced a laugh, harsh, brittle. "You don't understand politics, sweetheart," he sneered. "This is the way the world works. Money moves. Deals are made. You wouldn't last 5 minutes in the real game." The insult landed heavy, intended to belittle. But Jasmine leaned in, her eyes locked on him, her voice low, deliberate, every word carrying the weight of a hammer. "5 minutes," she said. "That's how long it took me to expose you. And you know it." The chamber gasped. The smirk on Trump's face faltered. His laughter stuttered and died. Jasmine pressed forward, relentless now, her words a storm unto themselves. "You've spent years mocking, threatening, bullying. But bullying doesn't erase bank records. It doesn't erase emails. It doesn't erase the truth that sits on this table for all of America to see." She turned slightly, her voice sweeping across the chamber, across the cameras, across the millions watching. "He calls the witness a traitor. He calls me a fraud. But what does he call the evidence? What does he call his own signature authorizing transfers that drained billions from the American people?" She slammed her hand against the folder. The sound echoed like a drumbeat. "Answer that, Mr. President." For a moment, just a moment, Trump was silent. His lips parted, but no words came. His face contorted, his fists clenched, but there was no quick retort, no easy deflection. And in that silence, Jasmine's power grew. Across the nation, people leaned forward in their chairs, their hearts pounding with the sense that something historic was unfolding. Trump finally erupted, his voice breaking under the weight of desperation. "You think you've won?" he shouted. "This is nothing but theater. A sham, a witch hunt, the biggest scam in American history." His voice cracked. The cameras caught it. The nation heard it. And Jasmine answered, not with fury, but with the calm of a woman who knew she had the upper hand. "No, Mr. President," she said, her voice steady as iron. "The biggest scam in American history is the one you tried to run." The chamber exploded again. Cheers, outrage, the sound of history tearing itself open. Trump's fist slammed against the table, his words dissolving into incoherent rage. His lawyers shouted objections, their voices drowned by the roar of the room. And Jasmine stood, still and unyielding, her presence cutting through the storm like a beacon. The cameras captured it, the contrast between fury and resolve, between a man unraveling and a woman rising. And for millions watching, the battle was no longer about politics. It was about truth standing against power. And in that moment, truth was winning. Robert Halstead adjusted the microphone in front of him, his hands steady, his eyes locked on Trump. "I did not come here with just word," he said, his voice calm, resolute. "I came here with proof." The chamber rippled with tension. Reporters froze mid-scribble. The chairman leaned forward, his gavel resting in his hand, forgotten for the first time in hours. Halstead reached into his jacket pocket once more, pulling out a small black recorder. The device was unremarkable, plain, almost invisible. But in that moment, it was a weapon far deadlier than any blade. He set it down on the table. "This," he said, his voice low but clear, "is a recording from a meeting inside the Oval Office. A meeting in which the president, Donald J. Trump, made a private agreement with foreign operatives." The chamber erupted into chaos. Lawyers screamed objections, their voices shrill. Members of Congress shouted over one another. The gavel slammed again and again, but the room had already shattered. And then, with the press of a single button, silence fell. A voice filled the chamber. Trump's voice. Rough, distinct, unmistakable. "We'll make it work," the recording crackled. "You get us the funding. The offshore accounts are ready. No one in Congress will ever trace it back. You'll have influence here, and I'll have the money where I want it." The words slithered out, each syllable heavy with corruption. Gasps shot through the room like lightning strikes. Pens clattered to the floor. Cameras whirred and zoomed, capturing the collective shock etched into every face. And then, the camera found him. Donald Trump. The color drained from his cheeks. The fury that had fueled him only moments before froze into something else. Something raw, something cornered. His lips moved, but no sound came. His eyes darted wildly across the chamber, as though searching for an escape. "Fake," he finally rasped, his voice trembling. "It's fake. It's been doctored. Everyone knows recordings can be manipulated." But no one seemed convinced, not anymore. The room did not roar with his words this time. It hushed, it leaned in, it listened, and the recording continued. Trump's voice again, lower, conspiratorial, dripping with arrogance. "They'll never find out. They'll argue, they'll yell, but in the end, they'll fold. They always fold. And when they do, we walk away richer than ever. That's the deal." The room froze in horror, because it wasn't just arrogance. It wasn't just greed. It was betrayal, spoken plainly, recorded in his own voice. The betrayal of a nation. Reporters shouted questions, their voices breaking the stunned silence. "Mr. President, is this your voice? Mr. President, did you authorize these deals? Mr. President, are you selling out the American people?" Trump slammed his fists against the table. "Enough," he roared. His face was crimson, sweat dripping down his temples. "It's fake, all of it. You're falling for lies, for propaganda. You're all pathetic." But his words no longer carried the thunder they once had. They cracked, they faltered, they reeked of desperation. Jasmine stood. Her presence alone pulled the cameras toward her, pulled the eyes of millions back into focus. She let the silence hang for a moment longer, letting the weight of the recording crush the chamber. Then she spoke, her tone sharp, controlled, merciless. "Mr. President," she said, "that is your voice. That is your deal. Those are your words, promising to sell out your own country for profit." Her words sliced like glass. You can call the witness a liar. You can scream fake until your lungs give out. But every person in this chamber, and every American watching from home, just heard the truth straight from your own mouth. The chamber shook again, not with chaos this time, but with certainty. Trump pointed wildly across the room, his voice breaking. "She's a fraud. This is treason. You're all in on it. You're all trying to bring me down because you know I'm too strong." But the more he shouted, the smaller he seemed. The President of the United States, once larger than life, once untouchable, looked suddenly like a man drowning, clawing at air, powerless against the tide closing in around him. Jasmine's eyes burned into him. "The strongest men don't fear the truth," she said quietly. Her words carried anyway, amplified by the silence that followed. "The weakest men do." The cameras captured the exact moment Trump's face contorted, not into rage this time, but into something far worse: fear. The chairman's gavel struck once, twice, 3 times. "This hearing will resume under order," he barked, though even his voice quivered with the enormity of what had just been revealed. But there was no order left, because the evidence was no longer paper. It was voice. It was undeniable. And as it echoed through the chamber, through the airwaves, through the veins of the nation itself, one truth was clear. Donald Trump had been caught in his own words, and Jasmine Crockett had just pulled the trigger. Trump erupted from his chair so violently that it nearly toppled backward. His face was a furnace of rage, his hands trembling, his jaw clenched so tight the veins bulged in his neck. "This is all stage," he thundered, his voice cracking with fury. "Every second of this is a setup, a coup against your president." The chamber gasped. Some members leapt to their feet, shouting protests, others shouting in agreement. The roar grew until it shook the air, until even the marble walls seemed to vibrate. Trump pointed across the room, his finger stabbing the air like a weapon. "They want to steal your country. They want to silence your voice. And this woman," he spat the word as if it burned him, "this woman is nothing but their puppet, a fraud sent to bring me down." The room splintered into pandemonium. Lawyers leapt up, shouting over one another. Trump's team banged their fists, waving stacks of papers, demanding every piece of evidence be stricken from the record. One attorney screamed so loudly his voice cracked. His face beat red as he barked, "Objection! All of it inadmissible! This is treason against the presidency." Trump's allies in Congress roared back in support, their voices blending into a cacophony of outrage. The chairman slammed his gavel. "Order! Order!" But there was no order left. The hearing had devolved into a battlefield. Trump slammed his fist against the table. "Block it!" he bellowed at his lawyers. "Every document, every file, every recording, they don't see the light of day. Do you hear me? Block it!" His attorneys scrambled, their voices frantic, throwing up objections, demands, procedural protests. The microphones picked up the sharp crack of binders slamming open, the rustle of papers flying, the rising panic of men trying to plug a dam that had already burst. Trump's chest heaved with fury. His voice cracked again, but he pushed through louder, more desperate. "This isn't justice," he roared. "This is an overthrow, a disgrace to this country. They want to take me down because I'm the only thing standing between America and chaos." And yet, through it all, Jasmine did not move. She remained seated, her back straight, her face calm, her eyes locked on him like a hawk watching a desperate, flailing prey. The contrast was blinding. Trump was fire, chaos, uncontrolled rage. Jasmine was ice, steady, cold, unyielding. And in that balance, the audience, the millions watching at home, saw where the truth lived. Finally, she rose. The simple act cut through the noise, drawing the cameras back to her. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was sharp, deliberate, and every word carried like the toll of a bell. "Mr. President," she said, "you can scream conspiracy, you can cry coup, you can throw every insult you have left, But none of that erases the evidence. None of that erases your own voice, your own words, your own betrayal. The chamber stilled, drawn into her gravity. You can command your lawyers to shout. You can order your allies to pound their fists. But you cannot order the truth out of existence. Not today, not here, not in front of the American people. Her words settled over the chamber like a verdict. Trump's face twisted, contorted with rage. "You don't speak for the American people," he roared. "I do." But his voice cracked again, thin and fragile beneath the weight of her composure. Jasmine turned her gaze toward the cameras, toward the millions watching. "Then let them decide," she said simply. Gasps rippled through the room. It was a challenge, naked and unflinching. Not to him alone, but to the nation itself. Trump staggered back into his chair, his fists trembling. He barked at his lawyers again, his words incoherent, drowned beneath the murmurs of a chamber that had shifted. Because the tide was turning, every scream, every denial, every desperate deflection only made him look smaller, weaker. And every calm word from Jasmine made her taller, stronger, her presence filling the room, filling the nation. The chairman's gavel pounded again, his voice strained. "Order! This chamber will return to order." But the chamber wasn't listening anymore. It was watching Trump unravel, watching Jasmine ascend. She looked back at him one last time, her voice quiet, measured, final. "Mr. President," she said, "history will not remember your excuses. It will remember your actions, and they are louder than any lie you could ever shout." The silence that followed was thunderous. Trump opened his mouth, but no words came. And in that silence, America understood. The desperate counterattack had failed. The tide belonged to Jasmine Crockett. She did not waste the moment. While Trump sat seething in silence, Jasmine reached into her folder and drew out a small silver USB drive. It glinted under the chamber's harsh lights, unremarkable to the untrained eye. Yet everyone present could feel the weight of what it carried. "This," she said, holding it high for the cameras, "is the final piece." The room gasped, a collective intake of breath. The lawyers erupted instantly, shouting objections, their voices shrill, desperate, overlapping one another. "Unverified," one barked. "Out of order. Out," another cried. But Jasmine ignored them. She stepped toward the evidence technician, placed the USB into his shaking hand, and said calmly, "Project it." A screen flickered to life at the front of the chamber. The lights dimmed, the room holding its breath. And then, words appeared. Emails, white text on a black background, each line branded with a White House domain. The first subject line froze the room. Re-offshore accounts. Presidential authorization. Gasps tore through the chamber. The emails scrolled downward, line by damning line, each one worse than the last. Proceed with transfers. POTUS approves. Ensure oversight is blocked. Congressional review must be delayed. President Trump has signed off. Move quickly. Each sentence landed like a hammer, each phrase like a nail sealing the coffin. And then, the final blow. An email with Trump's own digital signature. "Cover this, bury it, no one sees." DJT. The chamber exploded. Shouts, screams, outrage crashing like thunder. Members of Congress stood from their seats, fists raised, their voices shaking the air. Some shouted for impeachment, others for arrest. Reporters bolted to their feet, their fingers flying across keyboards, their cameras flashing so violently the chamber looked like it was being struck by lightning. "Order! Order!" the chairman cried, slamming the gavel again and again. But the chaos drowned him out. And then all eyes swung back to Trump. The cameras caught him in full, his face pale, his jaw slack, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the desk. For the first time, he looked small. For the first time, the mask had shattered. The chant rose from the gallery, faint at first, then swelling into a roar. "Resign! Resign! Resign!" It poured into the microphones, into living rooms across the country, into the ears of a president who had built his career on defiance, now cornered, exposed, undone. Trump slammed the table, his voice breaking as he shouted above the roar. "Fake! Fake, all of it! You can't prove a thing! You can't, but his words drowned beneath the fury of the chamber, because the evidence was not abstract anymore. It wasn't whispers, it wasn't accusations, it was in writing. It was his. Jasmine stood tall, her hand resting on the folder, her voice cutting cleanly through the chaos. Mr. President, she said, her tone calm, almost sorrowful. These are your words, your commands, your betrayal of the oath you swore to uphold. You cannot silence them. You cannot shout them away. You signed your own undoing. Her words echoed through the room, ringing louder than the chants, louder than the gavel. Trump glared at her, eyes bloodshot, lips trembling, but no words came. The silence between them was deafening. One congressman shouted, "Impeachment proceedings, now!" Another cried, "He sold out the nation!" The storm had broken. The chamber was no longer just divided. It was collapsing under the sheer gravity of what had been revealed. And Jasmine stood at its center, unflinching, immovable, a solitary figure who had cracked the armor of power itself. On the screen, the emails froze on the final line. No one sees. The irony hung like a dagger in the air, because now the whole world had seen. The chants grew louder, the fury rising until the walls shook. "Resign, resign, resign!" Trump slammed the table again, his voice lost, drowned in a sea he could no longer control. Jasmine turned toward the cameras, her eyes burning with quiet fire. "For too long," she said, "power has believed it could hide the truth. Today that lie ends. Today America sees." The roar erupted once more, deafening, unstoppable. And as the cameras broadcast every second, the nation understood. This was not just a hearing. This was the fall of a president, and Jasmine Crockett had delivered the fatal blow. The chamber, moments ago thunderous, now fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it crushes it. For the first time in the long, chaotic spectacle, Donald J. Trump sat motionless. No fists pounding, no insults flying, no bravado spilling from his lips. Only silence. And silence was the one thing he could never control. Across the aisle, something began to shift. Senators and representatives who had spent years defending him, who had shouted themselves hoarse in his name, now exchanged uneasy glances. Their eyes darted from the glowing emails on the massive screen to the slumped figure of the president. A few whispered. One shook his head, pale as stone. Another rubbed his temples, his shoulders sagging with the weight of betrayal. And then, one by one, they lowered their eyes, their loyalty cracking in full view of the nation. The defection had begun. Trump's lawyers whispered frantically, sliding papers toward him, tugging at his sleeve, but he didn't move. His jaw was tight, his breathing shallow. The cameras zoomed in close, closer than he wanted, catching every twitch, every bead of sweat sliding down his temple. For the first time, America saw not the strong man, not the unbreakable image of power, but a man cornered, trembling at the edge of collapse. Jasmine watched him, her posture unwavering, her gaze unflinching. She had waited for this moment, not for spectacle, not for vengeance, but for justice. And when she spoke, her words were calm, almost tender, but they carried the weight of history. "Mr. President," she said, her voice slicing through the suffocating silence, "you may hold the highest office in this land. You may sit in the most powerful chair in the world, but you do not sit above the law." The chamber gasped, not at the insult, but at the truth. It was the line that millions would replay, the line that would carve itself into textbooks, into headlines, into memory. "You are not above the law," she repeated, her tone harder now, her eyes locked onto his. Trump flinched. The cameras caught it. The nation saw it. In the gallery, murmurs rose, low, steady, growing louder. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens like daggers etching the moment into permanence. On the streets outside the Capitol, the chants shifted, swelling with a new rhythm. "Not above the law! Not above the law!" The roar seeped into the chamber, faint but undeniable, like a drumbeat rising from the heart of a country reclaiming its voice. Trump's allies looked around nervously. Some buried their faces in their hands, others leaned back in their chairs, defeated. A few still muttered objections, but their voices cracked under the weight of the evidence. under the inevitability of betrayal. The chairman's gavel rested quietly now. He did not strike it. He didn't need to. Order had returned, not through authority, but through the crushing inevitability of truth. And truth had chosen its victor. Jasmine did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence was her ally now, amplifying every word. "You promised to serve this nation," she said. "Instead, you served yourself. You promised to protect the people. Instead, you sold them out. You swore an oath on the Bible. And now," she paused, letting the silence hold the weight, "you are its violator." Trump's lips trembled. He tried to speak, to summon his familiar armor of bluster, but no words came. The chamber waited, watching, as his silence stretched into eternity. And with every second he said nothing, the mountain of evidence spoke louder. The screen glowed with his emails, his orders, his betrayal, staring down at him like an executioner's blade. Finally, he slammed his fist weakly against the table. This is treason," he muttered, but the words were soft, broken, stripped of their former power. No one listened, not even his own party, because something irreversible had happened. The myth of invincibility, the aura of untouchable power, shattered. And in its place stood Jasmine Crockett, not with anger, not with rage, but with the calm authority of a warrior who had delivered justice. The cameras lingered on her face, capturing the fire in her eyes, the steadiness of her presence. And millions watching at home saw her not just as a congresswoman, not just as an opponent, but as a symbol, the embodiment of truth, unyielding. The chairman finally leaned forward, his voice subdued, reverent. "This chamber," he said slowly, "has witnessed enough." The words rolled heavy, a declaration of the inevitable. And though no vote had been cast, no formal motion filed, everyone in that chamber knew. Trump's presidency had cracked beyond repair. Jasmine glanced at him one last time, her expression unreadable, somewhere between pity and resolve. "History will remember this moment," she said softly. And as her words sank into the silence, Donald Trump lowered his eyes, unable to meet her gaze. It was the first time in years that he looked not like a leader, not like a fighter, not like a president, but like a man who knew the empire he had built was collapsing beneath his feet, and Jasmine Crockett was the one who struck the final match. Outside, the crowd was swelling. Word of the hearing had spread like wildfire, carried across live streams, headlines, and whispers of disbelief. People poured into the streets by the hundreds, then thousands, gathering before the steps of the Capitol. Their voices rose in unison, raw and relentless. "Jasmine! Jasmine! Jasmine!" The chant shook the air, echoing off stone walls, rolling through the avenues of Washington like thunder. Homemade signs lifted above the crowd. Justice for America, no one above the law. Crockett for the people. It was no longer just a protest. It was an uprising of voices. Inside, the chamber felt the tremors. The roar outside pressed against the walls, seeping into every ear. The lawmakers stirred, emboldened by the sound. For years, many had cowered under Trump's shadow, too afraid to speak, too eager to protect their own survival. But now the tide had shifted. One senator slammed his palm on the desk. "We must open impeachment proceedings immediately," he cried, his voice trembling with both fury and liberation. Another rose to her feet, declaring, "The people will not forgive silence. We have no choice but to act." The chamber erupted again, not in chaos this time, but in demand. A collective demand for justice. Trump lurched forward, slamming his hands on the table so hard the microphone screeched. "Enough!" he bellowed, his voice ragged, desperate. "I am still your president. You will listen to me." But the words rang hollow, because no one listened. Not anymore. His lawyers tugged at his sleeve, whispering frantically, but even their voices had lost conviction. His allies looked away, their faces pale, their eyes fixed anywhere but on him. For the first time, Donald Trump was truly alone. He slammed the table again, harder this time, his voice breaking into a scream. "You think you can erase me? You think you can erase everything I've built? I made this country strong. I made it great. And this is how you repay me." But his words dissolved into the roar outside. the chants rising louder, surging like waves crashing against the Capitol steps. Jasmine! 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 Jasmine rose slowly, letting the room quiet around her, letting the chants beyond the walls become the soundtrack of her presence. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence leaned toward her, the cameras locked on her, the nation waiting. Mr. President, she said softly, the people have spoken. Her words were simple, but they carried like thunder. Their voices will not be silenced, and neither will the truth. The chairman cleared his throat, his gavel trembling in his hand. He had seen many hearings, many scandals, but never anything like this. This chamber, he declared, his voice heavy with gravity, has heard enough. Effective immediately, I move to open a formal inquiry into impeachment. The chamber erupted again, but this time in shouts of agreement. Lawmakers banged their desks, their voices overlapping in a chorus of history being written in real time. Yes, proceedings must begin. Accountability now. Trump staggered back, his chair screeching beneath him. His fists clenched, his breath came in ragged bursts. No, he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. No, you can't do this to me. But the chamber wasn't listening. The chants outside weren't listening. The nation wasn't listening. The tide had turned beyond him, sweeping him away in its current. Jasmine took a step forward, her gaze locked on him, her voice unshakable. You may have built an empire on fear. You may have ruled through intimidation, but fear collapses when faced with truth. She leaned closer, her voice steady enough for every microphone, every television, every ear in the country. And today, fear belongs to you. The cameras zoomed tight on Trump's face. His eyes darted wildly, his lips trembled, his chest heaved. He tried to summon the defiance that had carried him for decades, but it was gone. The crowd outside roared again, louder than ever, their voices flooding the chamber. Jasmine! 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 And for the first time, Donald Trump realized he was no longer the voice of the people. The people had found a new one. The chairman struck the gavel, his voice firm, final. The inquiry begins now. The words dropped like a verdict, sealing the moment in history. Trump collapsed back into his chair, defeated, his fists trembling on the desk. No one came to his defense. No one raised an objection. His empire had crumbled, not with a bang, but with the sound of his own power dissolving into silence. And standing above it all was Jasmine Crockett, unyielding, unbroken, her name echoing on the lips of thousands outside, millions across the nation. In that moment, the battle was no longer between Trump and Jasmine. It was between Trump and the people had chosen. The chairman's gavel struck 3 times, the sound ringing like the toll of a bell that marked the end of an era. His voice carried steady, solemn, heavy with the weight of history. This chamber will proceed, he declared, with a formal impeachment inquiry. The words fell like a verdict, echoing across the walls, across the cameras, across a nation holding its breath. The chamber erupted, not with chaos this time, but with conviction. Lawmakers stood to their feet, some shouting for justice, others simply bowing their heads, knowing history had turned. And at the center of it all sat Donald J. Trump, silent. His fists rested limply on the table, his shoulders hunched, his eyes ablaze with fury but dim by helplessness. For decades, he had dominated rooms with sheer presence, bending the air to his will, forcing reality to orbit around him. But not today. Today, the orbit had collapsed, and he was just a man, angry, cornered, powerless. He turned once toward Jasmine, his glare sharp enough to cut, his lips curling into a bitter snarl. But there was no strength behind it, no fire, no power, only rage without teeth. She met his stare with calm certainty. Then she rose, the cameras whirred to life, the chamber shifting with her movement, the crowd outside sensing the moment through screens and speakers. As she stood, the chants roared louder, pressing against the stone, spilling into the chamber like a tidal wave. Jasmine, Jasmine, Jasmine. She gathered her papers, tucked them beneath her arm, and turned toward the exit. The room parted around her, lawmakers stepping aside, journalists raising cameras, the crowd leaning forward as if pulled by her gravity. The heavy doors opened, and Jasmine Crockett stepped into history. Outside, the air erupted. Thousands filled the steps, their signs raised, their voices surging. Flashbulbs ignited, the night exploding into light as cameras captured every angle of her stride. The chants shook the pavement, rolling upward into the sky. Justice for America! No one above the law! Crockett! 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 She did not raise her hands in triumph. She did not bask in the glory. She simply walked forward, steady, unbroken, as if the storm behind her had not shaken her soul but strengthened it. Behind her, Trump remained trapped in the chamber. His lawyers tugged at his sleeve, his allies looked away, his enemies stood taller. For the first time, no one moved to shield him. For the first time, he was truly alone. The cameras caught it, the image of a man once untouchable now slumped in defeat, the weight of his empire crumbling over him. And as Jasmine disappeared into the crowd's roar, that image of Donald Trump would become the emblem of his downfall. The chairman's words echoed still, carried across headlines, across news anchors' voices, across the phones buzzing in hands across America. The impeachment inquiry has begun. It was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end, and everyone knew it. As Jasmine reached the steps, microphones swarmed, cameras flashed like lightning, voices begged for quotes. But she did not stop. She walked through the storm with a calm serenity, her eyes steady on the horizon. The people surged closer, hands reaching out, tears in their eyes. Some wept openly. Others shouted her name until their throats gave out. She paused at the top of the steps, turning once to face the crowd, the Capitol glowing behind her, the chants rumbling like thunder. For a moment, silence fell, not forced, not ordered, but born of reverence. And in that silence, Jasmine spoke the words that would define the night. In the battle between power and justice, she said, her voice clear as crystal, only truth is immortal. The words rolled over the crowd, over the cameras, over the nation itself. They were repeated instantly on television, shared across millions of screens, carved into headlines before the echoes faded. The chants returned, louder, fiercer, uncontainable. Truth is immortal. Truth is immortal. And as Jasmine Crockett descended the steps, swallowed by the roar of the people, by the blinding storm of cameras, by the weight of history itself, one truth settled into the heart of America. Justice had won. Donald Trump remained inside, his eyes burning, his jaw clenched, but his power gone. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the night, into history, her name etched forever into the story of a nation. And for generations to come, that night would be remembered not as the fall of a man, but as the victory of justice. In the end, the hearing was never only about one man's fall, nor one woman's rise. It was about the timeless struggle between truth and power. Jasmine Crockett's courage reminds us that justice does not belong to the loudest voice, but to the voice that refuses to be silenced. And for each of us, the lesson endures. When faced with lies, corruption, or cruelty, our duty is not to look away, but to stand tall. Because in the long march of history, truth always outlives fear. If this story shook you, don't just swipe away, hold it, share it, speak it out loud, like, comment, and send it to someone who still believes justice must stand taller than power. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where truth refuses to bow. Hit the bell, because the next story won't be gentle, it will be fierce, and it may change the way you see justice. This is a fictional dramatization, drawn from real corruption and real courage. Any resemblance to actual figures is symbolic, crafted for reflection, for warning, for hope. Thank you for watching. Justice isn't a gift, it's a fight. And here, we fight with stories. This is Harrison Stories,